you cannot be seen or heard, so for your own safety. So it's a recording just of myself and the panelists, and this is for any young people that aren't able to make the session today, to hopefully view later on once we've uploaded that to our website. However, we really encourage you to come along to our free sessions. We have 10 in total, and if you do manage to make all 10 of them, we would really like to award you with a certificate to just acknowledge your interest and commitment to finding out more about the sector, which would be, you know, a great enhancement for your CV or any university applications if it is an industry that you're interested in getting into. So the way this will work is we have a Q&A box that's on the panel at the bottom of your screen. Each of our panelists will be giving a short 10-minute presentation about themselves, their career, their experience, before we open out to a Q&A session. If you think of a question whilst you're listening, we encourage you to write your question in that Q&A box. If somebody asks a question that actually you'd really like the answer to as well, there's an option for you to like that question. So we do encourage you to like any questions that, yeah, actually you want to know the answer to that as well. And we will try and cover as many questions as we can in this live session. Anything that we don't manage to answer in the live session, we will follow up by sort of collating your questions. So no question is a silly question. Please just put it in the Q&A box, and we will cover that later on. Once we get to the end of our 10-week program, we'll be emailing out a sort of a kind of feedback information sheet with the answers to those questions that you've asked along the sessions. So make sure you sign up for as many of these free events as you can. Next week, we'll be looking at diversity in the built environment, and we'll have a panel of experts from of professionals working in the built environment from different ethnic backgrounds. So we'll be talking about the key issues, challenges and barriers they've overcome in that, as well as sort of positive experiences in the industry. So make sure you sign up for that next week. But on to today's session, which is all about landscape architecture and urban design. We have an incredible panel for you today. We've got the amazing Hazel Cunliffe, who is a project landscape architect from Layer Studio based in Manchester. Then followed by following Hazel, we've got Graham Marshall, who is an urban design. However, he has worked across both disciplines, from Pro Social Place based in Liverpool. And then finally, we have the amazing Tim Johns, who is from TEP. Again, somebody who is experienced in both urban design and landscape architecture, and he is based in Warrington. So that's enough from me. We're going to kick off with our first panelist, Hazel. So Hazel, if you'd like to say hello and share your screen, and we'll get listening.
Hello, I will just check that you can see my screen. I'll go to full screen. Can you see this screen? Okay, so when I was at school, I was quite interested in maths and art. I quite liked designing things, drawing things, and I just like numbers as well. So when I went to university, I did well, before I went to university for a degree, I did an art foundation course, which was a mixture of everything. I've lost my words. When I was on the art foundation, I was able to learn about a course called landscape architecture, which I'd never heard about. I knew nothing about it. I didn't know what it was. And I just thought, I fancy learning what that's all about. I then went to
Oh, Hazel has broken up there, I think. I'm not sure if we've maybe lost a connection her end. So if we just wait a few minutes, to see if she comes back. Otherwise, we can change the panelists order around and maybe come back to hear the rest of Hazel's story. Just to let you know that the session runs until 5:15. However, if you do want to stay around to have a few more questions answered, we might run until 5:30. If you do need to leave at 15:15, no issue at all. We seem to have lost Hazel. Okay, so if that's okay, we'll jump to you, Graham, to your presentation for now, and we'll try and get Hazel back on the call.
Hi, everybody. The joys of COVID and working. I've just had a call from a disabled neighbour that needs help as well. So, but I've got somebody else to do that for me. I'll keep talking whilst I'm sorting myself out here. Brilliant. So I left my computer for 2 seconds, came back, and Hazel had disappeared. So that's my second heart attack of the day because I lost my presentation earlier. So picking up from where Hazel left off, I also went to college to study landscape architecture. But before I left, I was doing A-levels in art and maths and geography too. And I grew up around Morecambe Bay, and variously around Morecambe Bay. I lived in Lancaster for a while, which is a big Roman city, so I had an urban experience of that. Also in Morecambe itself, which back in the day was still just about an active seaside town with all kinds of exciting things going on. But through my A-level art, I had to pick a subject for a written dissertation study. And I chose this building here, which is an Art Deco modernist building right on the seafront. So it wasn't in town, it was almost in the sea as well. It was on the shoreline, and that kind of place that changes all the time with people coming and going and the tide going in and out. And right across the background of the whole of this area was the Lake District, sometimes covered in snow, sometimes disappeared, sometimes really big and bright. And all those things I grew up with, and they kind of shaped the way I thought and felt about places. And it kind of excited me. And when I was looking for a career, I didn't have a clue what to do. And I bumped into a geography teacher in my previous school who was walking around town with an American landscape architect who'd come over on a European study tour. So I spent half a day walking around with him, talking about what this strange thing landscape architecture was that I'd never heard about before. And I got really excited about that. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to spend a lifetime changing places, making places better. So I wanted to get out of this small town as well. So I applied for a course in London, left, and never went back again. I visit now and again, but I went away and out into the world to start doing this thing. First thing I found was that I wasn't in a school of landscape architecture. I was in the School of Architecture, which is in what is now the University of Greenwich. So we had access to all the lectures. We had lectures and talks and visits and trips and things on all aspects of designing the built environment. And the first thing that I was interested in was modern architecture, coming from that hotel in Morecambe that I had to do a study on. And I'd never heard of Mies van der Rohe before, but as soon as I saw this building in Barcelona and walked around and in and sat there for hours, what absolutely fascinated me about this was the whole idea of the open plan, of being inside but feeling like you're outside at the same time, and vice versa. Space just flowed. It wasn't like any other building I'd been in before, or space, and it was in the middle of a city, and it just felt really calming and really beautiful. And then doing some study around that, you start to understand how this particular architect at the beginning of the 20th century actually changed the way we looked at buildings and places. We also had lectures, talks and trips to look at engineering developments as well. And about the same time in the 20th century, there were engineers like Maillart in Switzerland, who was doing brand new things. Previously, engineering meant looking at what somebody had built before that didn't fall down and trying to copy that and build on it and change and move around. But he started to think about analyzing those materials and how a bridge would actually stand up, how the bridge itself worked. And he kind of broke away from the tradition, as Mies had done in architecture as well. But the other thing that struck me about this is that he was also working with landscapes and environments and how these structures fit into those places and didn't compete. They were new, they were modern, but somehow there's a natural beauty within that as well. And then landscape, my own course, I was stood in the library one day, not knowing which books to pick up, and a tutor walked past, pulled the book off the shelf, stuck it in my hands and said, "You'd appreciate this." And it was about Lawrence Halprin, a landscape architect who was actually a contemporary of those other two designers, a little bit later, but still a contemporary, a modernist designer as well. But he went even further in terms of environment, and he was interested in the ecology of form. He also called himself an urban designer, was one of the very early uses of that term. And what he means by ecology of form is that he went out and he actually studied how natural processes worked, the sorts of places that our ancestors came from, the sort of where we came from the caves. Why do we choose certain environments to be in? And that developed a real interest in how to be quite contemporary and modern about how we develop our urban landscape. The other important thing was he worked with people. And in urban planning too, I was interested in Sorolla, the engineer who designed the grid for Barcelona. And the idea of that grid is to have this structured way of town planning. And he actually invented, in a sense, modern town planning, but especially the word urbanization, which is something we talk about now. And from this on the black bits, you can see how small Barcelona was 100 or so years ago and how big it has grown. And it's hard for us to contemplate today how small the world was 100, 150 years ago. But the interesting thing about this is that that framework didn't dictate everything. So this really was modern urban design as well, because each of those grids, streets, spaces, and everything can be designed individually. So there's something that holds the whole thing together, and then there's something else going on which allows for free thinking. But coming back to Halprin, you can see here on the left, that's how rocks and water work in the High Sierra. Halprin studied these sorts of things and then reconstituted them, and you see how people play. Some are on audience, some are active participants. You get the sound of that, you get the smells of that, you get the movement of places. He's also married to a famous dancer as well, and he talked about the choreography of place. So if you think about how people walk around towns and cities and move and animate in a way, if you take all the people away, you're just left with some rocks and water and glass and things. So it's absolutely essential to have people involved in that. So when I was doing my degree, I went back to my hometown in my final year project, and I tried to apply a lot of those things to it. But you can probably see from this the scale of my thinking at college. I made life difficult for myself by taking so much on, but I was really interested in how to grow and build and change a town and work on its natural assets. By the time I was doing my diploma on the left, I was looking at the whole Isle of Dogs, and although I was on a landscape course, this is pretty much urban design, looking at how you restructure a place. And this was the derelict docks of the mid-1980s in London, Liverpool, the same. There's absolutely nothing there. So how do you put a new structure in? And then a few years later, I was looking at the Royal Docks. You can just about see the Isle of Dogs on the left-hand side of that black and white drawing. That's a bigger area. But what I did there was try to experiment with, there's lots of architects and planners doing what we see as modern town planning today. But that drawing there is actually the west end of London, slid down the river and put over the top to get a sense of scale. So the docks at that area are the same width as the Thames is further up in the centre of London. And St James's Park is the same size as something like that. And that was really very interesting. And it's really important to be able to have the freedom of not having a client that wants something specific, but to be able to stand back and actually think about cities and how they work. When I got down to practice, one of my first big jobs when I was 30, I took over the Garden Festival in Wales. So there's a Garden Festival in Liverpool, some of you may be familiar with. It was a huge project, but it was a restoration project, and a project in a really poor area, something the industry had gone and everything was failing in the place. Now this project, it was huge. I got to practice all kinds of things. I pulled all my skills together, from landscape to arts to building to restoration to construction. But the one thing it didn't do was anything for any of the people that live there. And that, I was doing my MA at the time as well, and that really struck me, and it moved me on into practice. And I thought, no, I don't want to be a landscape architect anymore. This isn't going to make places better. It was really, I really enjoyed it, and it was really good, but I really wanted to work on that. So going across the top of the board, one of the first big things I worked on was a metro system for Birmingham. Now, transport planners had planned that out, so that's the planning side of things, but how would it fit into the place and how would it work? So the top drawing is a big route coming out of Birmingham to the airport. We suggested, yes, we'll do the work, but that's not what you want to do. That's not going to work unless you make the centre of Birmingham work. So we managed to change the client and change the project, and we really got to implement and build the tram system in the centre as a hub for Birmingham. So that's one thing an urban designer does. He asks new questions. The middle picture at the top is London Bridge Station, which I worked on 25 years ago, and the same sort of thing. All of those arches and things were completely derelict and boarded up, and it had a few roads running through. And we were told, you can't shut the roads down, the system needs it. But 25 years later, go back, and that's absolutely fantastic station now with the whole thing opened up. And then coming along to the top right, it's also, urban design is also about creating documents that help push those ideas forward. So the Cork one was about taking heritage seriously in a city that didn't take heritage seriously. And the other one, the Urban Design Compendium, is a national document to bring all urban design thinking together to help other professions do things. Across the bottom as well are some bigger scale, you might call them, the centre one is like a town extension to Edinburgh. The other is a new town, but the key thing is the diagram on the right, and that's where urban design comes into its own, is having those really strong ideas that you can express simply to people to try and capture their imaginations about what it is that they need to do. Moving on into the noughties, I was founding director of Liverpool Vision, and the big thing here was to think about the whole city centre. There are a lot of complex problems here, but what do you focus on? What are the big things that will make change? And if any of you remember what Liverpool was like, probably difficult 20 years ago, it is quite different now. But one of the problems was the top right picture is a big piece of architecture that someone wanted to come in and build a shopping centre that was all about looking in on itself. But instead, we managed to reject that and build Liverpool One instead, which reaches out and stitches back into places. And it's that thinking.
Hi, Graham. Sorry to interrupt there. We're on 11 minutes, so we might have
30 seconds and I'll be done. So my practice now is actually has moved on. So I feel like those early pioneers in the 20th century to actually thinking about health and well-being. So on the right is stuff we're doing with the NHS. The bottom right is some of the scientific work we're doing. But the central one is the most important thing, which is about working with people and going around in circles all the time, starting with people, trying things out and coming back and asking the questions again. And the final slide is everybody is an urban designer. That's a view of Liverpool at night. Nobody can deal with all that themselves. We need the strategy to make that work, but we also need to understand what it's like to be stood in the street, living in a house, and how the lives work. And urban design pulls those two things together. And that's me finished. That's
thank you so much. You've definitely
10 years in college and 30 years working in 12 minutes.
I know, it's a hard task. Thank you. It's brilliant to see the visuals as well, and we're getting the questions coming in. So thank you so much. I think Hazel has a few issues with her connection, but it's okay. We're going to go to you, Tim, if that's okay. I will share my screen in your presentation. If you unmute yourself,
Sure.
Hopefully you are. Can you see that? I hope you can.
I can't see it yet, but if everybody else can, yep, that's good for me.
Can you see it?
I can.
Okay, brilliant. So let me know when to move on to slides.
Okay, good to meet you folks. So I'm Tim Johns, living in Manchester and usually working in Warrington. And for several decades, I've been working in various places in the Northwest since graduation. This slide isn't too far away from Morecambe. I was listening to Graham's earlier presentation. This is actually Rydal Water in the Lake District. And it's the Lake District itself has had a real impression on me since an early age. An aunt and uncle of mine ran a farm near Newby Bridge, and although they struggled to make a living from the land, they were always very hospitable to me as a young boy, and I really loved to go and visit them. And that sort of passion to go to the Lake District has stayed with me. I'm an open water swimmer, a fell runner, and a cyclist, not all three together, but sort of separately. Now, alongside that sort of love for the environment, I've also really been interested in towns and cities, having traveled in my early life due to my dad's job. So the next slide just gives you a sense of the my journey. Over a number of decades, put very simply. After school, I went to University of Manchester and first did an architecture degree and then a postgraduate in landscape design. And then my first job was for a small practice of 10 employees. You know, I was thrown at the deep end, but I did a bit of everything from T-boy to site visit, site work, helping with drawings. And after a few years there, I moved on to a local authority, which was the other end of the scale, several thousand employees, and really interesting experience to engage with people from different disciplines. Moved on to a multidisciplinary firm called Atkins, which is engineering by background, but they certainly have a number of disciplines there now, including architecture, landscape architecture and town planning. And most recently, for the last 10 years, I worked for TEP, which is a medium-sized enterprise of around 140 members of staff. So over the years, I've garnered certainly sort of some all-around experience. And the next slide is some project work recently that we've been involved with, a garden village down in Cornwall, just to the west of the cathedral city of Truro. And just to give you a sense of the scale of that slide there, sort of east to west is around 2 miles. So it's a really big site. And it's this vision of a garden village, really, about live, work and play in a high quality environment. Picking up the garden city of the early 20th century, which was about town in a countryside environment. And I guess what's the aspiration really is for the garden village is somewhere excellent for people to live. Over 40% of the site is some type of green space, very energy efficient buildings, encouraging people to not use the car, to cycle and walk wherever possible. Doorstep green space with a population eventually by 2040 of 10,000 people. Now the next slide just gives you a bit of a visualization of how it could be. And it's a picture of the village. You know, you can see the energy efficient buildings there, the solar panels, the character of the landscape there for recreation, also quite natural in its character to encourage wildlife. Other key things really is how to manage biodiversity, you know, to make sure that the site is left in a better state than when the building started, and also the importance of managing water, a concept called sustainable drainage. Now the next slide is a current project that I'm working on now. I'm just going to ask Hazel just to use her cursor to sort of demonstrate the extent of the site on the right of the slide.
You mean me, Tim? And I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can
India even. Yes, thank you.
Can you see my cursor? I'm here.
I can see it. Really, it's just to show the viewers that it's a really big site. It's about 4 miles long across the map there. And what you can see in the middle of the picture there is a rendered part of that jigsaw, which in itself is about half a mile across. So it's a big scale sort of plan, and it's really about repurposing this the River Erewash just to the west of Nottingham, currently liable to lots of flooding, hidden behind buildings. poor water quality, and not easily accessible. And the long-term vision really for the whole corridor of 3.5 miles is to repurpose the river corridor so it would become a regional park. And it would be a great venue for off-road biking and walking, and lots of new lakes to absorb any floodwaters during a storm or flood risk, and also great for nature. Now the next slide is, I'm not sure if any of you saw Planet Earth last night, David Attenborough's program on BBC One, really about really the need for people to try and address the issue of climate change. This is a big scale project which kind of looks at some of those climate change issues down in North Kent, a big study area there. So it's 15 miles across by 12 miles from top to bottom, so you get a sense it's a big area in North Kent. And it's what's called a green infrastructure planning project, really looking at how we can help the local authority plan in the next 20 years to help its residents live healthier lives, be good for wildlife. Obviously, we've got issues with wildlife being restricted by development and also the climate change, rising temperatures. So it's really a project to assist with those sort of many issues. And the next slide just shows the same area and uses a technique called geographical information systems, GIS, which is a really useful tool to attach data to a map. And what we're trying to show here with this heat map is to show where green infrastructure, woodlands and countryside can deliver the most benefits for people and nature. And it just helps us to advise the local authority to help them plan for the coming years. Now, the next few slides really are just some of the perks of the job, you know, some of the aspects of the job that I really like and have been able to enjoy. So on all the projects we get involved with, you'd always get a site visit. And certainly those earlier projects that I talked about down in Cornwall, Nottingham and in Kent, spent plenty of time on site. And I've been to all sorts of places around parts of England I've never been to before, East Anglia and Northamptonshire and Somerset. So great opportunities to see different places. And the next slide just shows the type of work we get. We get involved with collaboration. So around the table there, we've got architects, engineers, urban designers, town planners and clients. And obviously not in COVID times, but in usual times, we would typically meet around a table with papers and tracing paper and work out the best for a particular project to make sure it was fit for purpose. And my last slide really is about engagement. Now, we as designers are, skilled in our ability to design, but at the end of the day, we're often designing for other people, people that are going to live in the homes we design, or the parks that we design, or the towns and cities. So while the designer can have some great ideas, we can get great experience and knowledge from local people with their local knowledge and their experience of place. And they're also really good at critiquing and challenging our emerging ideas. So this is a slide for some work we did in Ellesmere Port in Merseyside for a neighbourhood plan. And you can see around the table there's all sorts of representatives there from the church, from the police. There was also some teachers and some health professionals. So it just made sure that throughout the project we were responding to what really local people needed. So India, that's my talk. Hopefully I'm within the 10 minutes almost. But
yes,
yeah, I've been
Thank you so
conscious
much.
of time.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Tim. Really interesting to see some examples of the projects that you've worked on and that some of those visuals there. So I think Hazel sends her apologies. I think she's got a few issues with tech going on her end. So I think what we will do is go straight into the questions. I can see that a few of them have come through now. So just to start us off then, we've got a question here saying, what would you say are the main differences between architecture and engineering, e.g. structural engineering? Also, have you had to change any plans dramatically due to the physics of the buildings? So
that's mine, isn't it?
would you like
Yeah.
to take that question, Graham?
Depends on what level of each discipline that you're working in. One of the projects I worked in early in my career was oh my God, I've forgotten. Earl's Court, the Earl's Court building. That was designed at the time, probably still is, the largest single span building in Europe, a great big huge arch. And the architect that was leading, the architectural partner that was leading that, he knew as much about structural engineering as any structural engineer. He knew what he wanted, he knew what the art of the possible was, but he needed a structural engineer who had an interest in that to be able to take that forward. Some fantastic structural engineers I've worked with as well have been really good architects too. So if you look at the new exhibition centre on Liverpool waterfront, that company is first and foremost a structural engineering company. So they bring things in. So it's about the ethos and the lead. So the further you progress in your career and how far you want to take it, you can start to bring lots of these things together. And changing plans dramatically, if things start off with the right ethos, you shouldn't have to change things. And that's the whole thing about multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary working. If there's teams there, things ought to work forward well. I suppose the biggest risk is when you're doing something new and pioneering and pushing the edges. That's usually when you get a really good team coming together to make sure that happens well. Hope that answers the question. Thank
you, Graham. Great, thank you so much. And Tim, can see you've put yourself forward to answer our next question, which is, as a landscape architect, do you do small jobs like houses or new build, or sorry, I've misread that, or new build home landscapes, or is it just concentrated in large scale design projects? So yes, yeah, sorry, do you do small jobs like houses, or is it just concentrated on large scale design projects?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Arthur. I think hopefully if we'd seen Hazel's presentation, I think her focus would really have been more on the smaller scale work. And to be fair, that when I started out in my career, I worked on the kind of smaller scale projects, which I really enjoyed. It's just over time, variety is interesting, and I sort of gradually during my career have kind of moved on to the larger scale projects, which hopefully you've just had a little bit of a flavour of. So I think typically a landscape architect would start out small, but if they like the idea of moving on to bigger scale, there would be that opportunity.
India, could I just add something to
yes, of course.
Said as well? Something I picked up really early on in my career from a tutor was that Beethoven produced great operas and great musical pieces, but he loved designing smaller pieces for children's wind-up toys as well. And Tim will know this, you have to really understand the detail as well. Even when you're working at the high scale, even when you work there all the time, you know what quality of thing you want at that smallest scale as well. And I think that's the really good thing about landscape architecture and urban design, is being able to jump between those two scales, and it's important to be able to do so as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that contribution there as well, Graham. Okay, so this is a bit more of a general question, but I don't know whether you two may have some response to it, but what skills and extracurricular activities make a person more employable? I suppose if thinking about looking into going into a career in the built environment or landscape architecture or urban design, are there any particular skills you feel are useful to have in that job, or are there any kind of extracurricular activities young people could be getting involved with now to help them gain those skills?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to have a go first and then hand over to Graham. I think, a design, it's really useful to have drawing skills for a design course. So if you're taking art at school, that's really great. If not, then maybe just develop your own sketching ability. I think that I'd really recommend that. Travel is great. I'm conscious at the moment it's not a great time for travel, but if you do get the opportunity to visit different places, if you are interested in landscape or urban design or architecture, go to some historic towns and cities and sort of get a sense of what's special about them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What I would add as well is that you need passion to make this thing work. It can be quite hard, and if you're building up a passion all the time or wanting to find things out, don't be afraid of telling people if you're looking for work or going onto a course or something. Tell them about that passion that you have, and the best way to make that authentic and the best way to develop your career as well is you don't have to be quite as sad as I am. I go around on holiday taking photographs of steps and ravens and things, even though I'm working at the city scale. I'm really interested in the street scale. But while you're walking around your streets, think all the time about what you feel about a place. When you walk in somewhere, if it doesn't feel safe or you don't like it or something like that, it'll just register. But if you want to be a designer, ask yourself, why don't I like this, or do I like it? Or if you find something awesome, just do that extra little bit of thinking, and that starts to build something in your mind. It builds an understanding of a place in a mind, and then as you start to practice, you will start to solve some of those issues and problems, or take opportunities to create beautiful things, and it's a constant 24/7 building up of those skills. So drawing is really important. Taking photographs, I'd say drawing was probably of places. Sketching is probably the more important thing, because it makes you look and spend a bit more time looking at things. But I think it's just being absorbed in your environment.
Thank you. We also have a question here. For landscape architecture, does it include terraforming alongside with planting and designing?
So I'm going to assume the question there is about landform, and it does very much, actually. Yeah, the project I showed in Cornwall, the garden village, what I couldn't show there is actually it was a very steeply sloping site. So landform was really important, and yes, so I would say, I think, yeah, landform and using landform to make sculpture and to plant on is very much part of the job.
And just to add a reminder of what I was talking about with Lawrence Halprin as well, his ecology of form. It's understanding how the processes of land work when you're developing those landforms, and think about sometimes how people will respond to those as well. So it's building up those skills too.
And I guess that almost sort of ties in with another question here. Do you have to consider the environment, for example, parks?
In the sense of
I guess when sort of taking on a new project.
Yeah, a big part of, if I've understood the question correctly, a big part of a landscape architect might be to remodel a park, redesign a park, or even design a new park. So the Erewash River corridor that I showed earlier, that was essentially a 3-mile long linear park from an existing river corridor. So yes, parks are very much part of the job.
And do you have to, we've got another question here, do you have to consider all types of infrastructure, for example, transport or pipes as well?
Yeah, interesting. Well, as from a landscape perspective, certainly that is part of that of landscape planning, I think, at that scale of things. When you're talking about pipes, we're talking about infrastructure that can be under the ground. You really have to think about the interface with what happens above the ground. So if you plant a tree, it's going to have roots. What is the impact of that going to be, or vice versa? From an urban design perspective, when we were looking at Liverpool, one of the big things we had was to grow the population in the city centre. It's grown by, I think, 20,000. No, it's grown by 40,000 people since I started that work a lot of 20 years ago. But we suddenly found that there wasn't enough electricity or gas to come into the city centre to allow us to do that. And then you start thinking about broadband and think, oh no, that's a project. So we had to bring in specialist consultants to actually look at the whole infrastructure of the city. So planning often just looks at the colouring in of the plans and drawing stuff up and say that's what we'd like to do. But urban design then goes to, but how would we? So absolutely, and there's just so many things to think about, and it gets quite exciting when you hit a problem like that and you think, well, wow, I never thought of that before.
Tim, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, again, the Error Wash project that I showed there, the linear park, what we couldn't show there was the live sort of railway network. So we had to consider the park in relation to the rail and the road infrastructure, actually. So yeah, we do work a lot with engineers to make sure that we can achieve our visions.
Great, thank you so much. And I can see you've put yourself forward to answer another question here. Do you ever look at was that, sorry?
Back to back.
Yeah, why not? Go for it. So do you ever look into historic maps to find inspiration for how to rework a landscape in its original form? This really interests this young person. So.
Absolutely. So the Langgarth Garden Village in Cornwall that I showed earlier, very much a historic site. So we took a look at the historic maps, the old road from Truro to Redruth, I think it was, going back centuries. We looked at the historic field pattern, you know, going back to medieval times, you know, how they'd used the land, and it did actually inform some of our proposals. So yes, it's a big part of what we do is kind of looking into history.
And if I can add to that,
thank you.
Sorry,
yeah,
if I can add to that from an urban perspective, the Liverpool example I showed you of the new shopping area in the centre, the first plan just threw a big building on that linked the Albert Dock to the town centre, and that's all that they wanted to do. But Liverpool 1 actually rebuilds the street network of Liverpool from the origins of the river. It works with how not so much the Mersey, but how the creek that formed Liverpool in the first place, it's built around that. And all the whole shape of Liverpool city centre, the connections across Liverpool city centre, all home in on that. So it's really, really, the physical thing is really in structure, but also the social thing of how people move around a place and connect with each other is really very important. So it is a lot more than just the buildings and the nice architecture and things like that. It's pretty fundamental, I think. As Tim was saying.
That almost kind of sort of slightly links into another question we've had, which is how do you categorize the things you include when it comes to the planning?
How do you categorize? There's a process to start with when you're working at our scale of things in landscape and urban design. There's a process of getting to know your site. Some of it is you can call it a survey, the things that you know. The other thing is the next thing you move on to is an appraisal, and part of that is what you feel about what you've found. How does it work? So the survey will tell you what's there and what's missing. Those feelings will be telling you how it works. And there's then an analysis stage where you start to put those things together. And then there's the concept stage of thinking about, well, what could this place become? What could we do here? And you start to pull those things together. And hopefully if you do it in a co-design way, working with communities as well, that starts to lead you towards a design. So you don't just come in and come up with a design. You actually go through a thinking process of understanding places.
Thank you, Graham. I'm just going to ask definitely two more questions. I know, Tim, you've put yourself forward to answer this one anyway, but definitely something that's that has been light as a question is, and I suppose both of you can comment on this, having worked across both disciplines, but what is the main difference between landscape architecture and urban design? I know that's a big question, but in the most simplest terms, can you explain the difference, the main
I'll do my best, and I'm sure Graham will want to add to what I say, but which is absolutely fine. I mean, for me, landscape architecture already is pretty broad, but it's considering typically soft spaces. It could be an area of countryside, it could be a park, it could be a coastline. It's typically the sort of non-built elements that you find in sort of towns and countryside. For me, urban design is kind of more focused in the town centre or the sort of the city centre as an example. And Graham will go on to say more, but it's often the sort of the way buildings are arranged, the systems behind those buildings, the street, the public realm, which are public areas in the city. So I've tried to keep it simple, and I'm sure Graham will want to add to that.
Yeah, I think, well, the first thing I would say is that when urban design first started to become a thing, a discipline, was probably, well, I mentioned Lawrence Halprin previously, and that's how he practiced. But at the bigger scale of government and policy and things, it's probably the 1980s, certainly the 90s, that urban design became mainstream, and then everybody became an urban designer that could draw and do these things. But from 2 or 3 employers and my own experience looking at work around Europe, landscape architects do tend to make very good urban designers because of the strategic way of thinking, of looking at land. And I think the most important thing about, say, towns and cities and urban design is it's a human habitat. It's one that we have created. It's not just a town or a building or architecture. It's actually a human habitat, and it should be able to support us as well as possible. And these are the sorts of things that landscape architects think and do and talk about all the time. There's a really strong environmental, ecological aspect to that. But I think the difference, in a succinct way of putting it, is that urban designers, the ones that aren't just doing big master planning, are actually usually creating the projects. They're looking at places before there's a client. They are the client. They are looking at how do we change a place, and from that strategies emerge, and then projects emerge from that. Now, the interesting thing is, after you've done all that important work, all the other professions then come in and go and do the projects, and they get their names against it and get the praise, and you disappear into the background. So it's quite a self-effacing discipline as well, that although you've set wheels in motion, you're usually forgotten about unless you've designed something like Barcelona. But can I just give you a quick interesting fact? Serro, that designed the Barcelona grid, was a very rich man. He inherited his family money, became a councillor, and spent the whole of the rest of his life making that thing happen. And at the end of his life, he died a pauper because he had to spend all his family fortune pushing himself forward and doing that. So it's a pioneering thing like that. Some people become famous and rich as well. There's a difference there in that you go out looking to make a difference, as opposed to looking or having a client approach you to come and do a piece of work.
Yeah. So yeah, and definitely sort of passion behind it and dedication.
It's not black and white like that, but that's a modus operandi, really.
We've had a few questions coming in from our young people as well about A levels, GCSEs. What would you recommend I study to get me into the industry along the right lines? We've got people thinking of doing 3D design. We've got other young people worrying that maybe because they're not studying art, that's going to put them at a disadvantage. Do you have any comments to make on that? And does it really matter what A levels our young people choose? Will that hinder them getting into the industry or advance them in some way? Shall I go to you, Tim, and then you, Graham, and then to you, Graham?
Yeah.
Sure.
Tim.
So I went to school several decades ago in Scotland, so I was lucky. I could choose 5 subjects at higher levels. So I think I'm trying to recall. I did geography, art, maths, physics, and English, and maybe some more actually after that. So I was fortunate I could get a broad range. I'm just thinking back now. I think the useful ones for me really probably were, you know, art, maths, and English. You know, I now I do a lot of writing. Previously, you know, I did, you know, quite a lot of designing, and drawing's really important. But you know, if you're not taking art, I wouldn't lose heart at all. I think that, you know, there'll be opportunities for you to develop your own sketching skills. I'm sure, you know, when we hopefully get out of COVID, you know, a night school, learning, you know, sketching sort of outside of your normal school hour. So I think it's also about sort of getting, you know, work experience again out, hopefully outside of COVID, just getting periods of time in a design office just to get a sense of what goes on, and you know, learn different skills.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah,
Graham, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I'd agree with all of those things. I think I mentioned earlier that I did maths, geography, and art, general studies, and I did an AS, and I cannot for the life of me remember what it was, but it was similar to Tim's. I also did design and technology O levels, so all of these things around making, creating, and things are all really useful. However, don't lose heart if you're not doing those things. I think for landscape architecture, geography is really quite important, and I particularly well, I enjoy both, but I was really interested in human geography. But the sociology, the psychology, there's all sorts of things, because we're living in a different age now, and we need to be thinking about health and well-being. But the key thing I'd say is I've mentored quite a few mature students who have wanted to change professions in their 30s, and move into urban design, and they say, I can't draw. Well, you can, everybody can draw, and this is something that Placed, so if you come on the Placed activities, they will show you that you don't have to be Rembrandt or Picasso. What you need to do is learn to communicate through models and sketches and things, and it's just the same as handwriting. It's just learning some of the techniques of how to express your ideas. So if you think back to the middle of my slides, I had a big diagram up there for Edinburgh that changed the shape of Edinburgh, and I drew that in a cafe on a paper tablecloth. I was a little bit annoyed with some of my other consultants that were working for me, and there was a saucer and a plate and a plastic spoon involved in that. It's just about being able to get that diagram together. But if you're not doing those things, go out sketching, take photographs, demonstrate that you're interested. So when you can put a portfolio together that way. If it's nothing more than going around lots of towns and collecting up postcards and sticking them in a scrapbook and writing down next to those postcards why you think someone took that picture, why that represents this town. There's so many different ways of demonstrating that you can look and see and be creative about things, and you will learn to draw really quickly at college. That's what they're there to teach you to do. But you've got to show that you can look and see. I think that's the main thing. Thank
you, Graham. And actually, we do have one of our sessions focusing on portfolios. What is one? How do you make one? So make sure you sign up to come along to that if you're interested. Okay, I think we'll just wrap up this session today. Thank you so much for your knowledge, experience, insight into landscape architecture and urban design. But just to finish off, could I ask you, do you have a top tip or something you wish you'd known before you started off on your career that you could maybe share with our young people before we end the call? I know I've put you on the spot there. Tim?
Yeah, sure. I think I would have, I do have a mentor now, but I think from my early career and even at the end of school, tried to find a mentor, somebody that could have, a bit older, a bit wiser, could have just helped me along the way with their experience, the better benefit of their experience, could have asked questions. I think the key thing for me looking back would be to have a mentor throughout your career. You might change your mentor during the course of your career, but I think mentor is really important.
Yeah, absolutely echo that advice. Most people are flattered when you ask them to be your mentor as well. So really be brave, ask, you know, you learn off other people. Absolutely. Graham.
Yeah, I absolutely echo that. I also mentioned I met an American landscape architect in a street in my hometown, and even that afternoon, that was fantastic mentoring. But I've always managed to find those people in the practices and places I've worked in, and never be afraid of asking questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. All it means is you don't know something, and people are so willing to help you do things. So ask questions all the time. But my other, sorry, I can't even remember the question now.
Top tip.
That's my answer.
Your one final top tip.
The top tip, yeah, that's what it is. The top tip for learning and things. If you find yourself stuck in a job doing something you don't enjoy, move. Don't leave yourself trapped in there. But take from that job, think about that job. What is it I don't like about this? What is it that this job isn't giving to me? And then go and do some research in different practices and find out what different, there might be nothing wrong with that job, it's just not for you. Look at all the practices. There's loads of information out there on the web now, and see what kind of work they're doing. So if you look at Tim's practice, really interesting looking stuff there. Wow, when you want to get involved in that, and then phone them up and say, can I have a conversation? I'm sure Tim would open his doors for someone that was passionate and said, can I come in to have a conversation with you about your work?
Thanks, Graham. That's great. So we've got find yourself a mentor. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And if you don't like something, move. Really follow your passion and interests and do something that you enjoy. So thank you so much, young people, for joining us on this.
Sorry, and go and knock on doors and introduce yourself. Don't be afraid to push yourself forward.
Once the pandemic's over. Amazing advice from our panel. Thank you so much. So that brings us to the end of our event today. We hope to see you at the next ones next Monday. If you could now exit the call, that would be great. I am not able to, I might have to actually just end this call now. So thank you to Graham, thank you Tim, thank you to the young people that joined us, and yes, okay, take care.